Okay then, ethical implications and social sensitivity. This is the last topic in issues and debates. Now, key terms to do with this topic. You should already be familiar with these from your Year 1 research methods study. Ethical issues, where you've got a conflict between research and the rights of participants. Ethical guidelines, guidelines that protect participants in research. Ethical implications, so the impact that research has on society, how it influences policy, or how certain groups of people are seen by the rest of society as a result of research. So two new terms then to go with those for this topic. Socially sensitive research, that just means any research that might be controversial, for example research into race or sexuality, or research that has wider social implications outside of the research context for participants. So for example, if research shows something negative about a certain social class or a certain race, that can have wider social implications outside of just the research. If other people learn about this research, it can have negative implications for those people. And then the last kind of key term is implications of socially sensitive research. So where research has implications where it might give scientific credibility to prejudice and discrimination, and it might be adopted for political purposes by the government. So that's the new part really of this topic. You're already aware of many ethical issues and so on. It's the socially sensitive part that we're going to focus on here. And there's a piece of research here that picked out many things, but there are 4 things here that we're drawing out in terms of socially sensitive research, things that should be considered and things that we should be concerned about if we're conducting socially sensitive research. Things like implications, where you might be giving scientific status to prejudice, making it okay to be prejudiced because there's science behind it. Uses of research. So research that's conducted could be used, even if you conduct it with the best intentions in the world. If you're conducting research into a particular race and it shows something, that could potentially be used for the wrong purposes or for political ends. And it's really important to fully consider that before embarking on any such research. How is it likely to be used at the end? Is this going to lead to a really negative situation? The validity of the research. So in the past, some findings have been completely made up. We'll come back to that. And a risk-benefit ratio. You should always consider the costs and the benefits before doing any research, but particularly in this case you should try and minimise any risks, but it's hard to determine what the risks are before undertaking a piece of socially sensitive research. You may find something different from what you expect. It's also hard to determine what the benefit is, so that's something that you need to be aware of before undertaking any research. Okay, thinking about evaluation, there are good things about carrying out socially sensitive research. It's been argued that when we study underrepresented groups, ethnic minorities and so on, that can help give us a better understanding, and actually that can reduce prejudice and help acceptance. So if we understand issues or understand differences, that can help communication. Also, socially sensitive research has benefited society, so it's not necessarily always negative. Things like Loftus's research on eyewitness testimony, where she identified how unreliable eyewitnesses can be, has had really positive social implications for society in terms of not relying on eyewitness testimony to convict criminals and so on, because we understand how unreliable it is. That's been a benefit to society. That was a piece of research that had social implications, so it would be considered socially sensitive. Equally, Milgram's research on obedience, also socially sensitive, but has had big benefits for society. We understand how people can be coerced into doing something that they believe is morally wrong. That's had a really positive impact on society, that knowledge. Okay, limitations then. I mean, some of these are fairly obvious. The fact that it can have damaging social implications. You'll read about this research in your booklet. Bert did some research about intelligence and how it was genetically based, and that basically led to the 11+ exam in the UK, where children had to sit an exam at 11, and that determined whether they would go on to have an academic education, or whether they went on to have more like an apprenticeship, based on their intelligence test that they did at the age of 11. And we now know that much of his results were made up, and that completely limited the opportunities of many children, without good cause. So that's one example where it can have really damaging social implications. A whole generation of children missed out on a good education as a result of that. It can be used for social control. So we've touched already on eugenics, and one kind of branch of that was where citizens in the US, some were sterilised, i.e. they couldn't have children. They were given an operation to stop them from being able to have children, and that was sometimes without their knowledge or consent. Forced sterilisation was a result of research about intelligence and things like that. So that's one example where it might be used for social control. Another example is Milgram's obedience research. If we understand the situational factors that can make someone obey, we can manipulate those factors to make people obey, to make people more likely to obey orders when we want them to. So it's kind of social control, manipulation. Another limitation is that it gives a get-out clause, so that people take less responsibility for their behaviour. It might. So, for example, research about the warrior gene, MAOA, can mean that people can argue in court that actually there's a genetic basis to their aggression and that it's not their fault. Equally, Milgram means that people can argue that situations caused their obedience, it wasn't their fault. So socially sensitive research could have those sorts of implications. Could lead to prejudice and discrimination. One example of that, again, is another sterilisation program in the US as a result of culturally biased IQ testing, which we touched on in culture. But, you know, equally, simply the research becoming known means that just everyday people who hear about it will treat that group of people differently. Not necessarily in big ways, but that group of people may be prejudiced against, they may be marginalised, all sorts of things, just in slightly different ways of being treated. It doesn't have to be a massive thing like sterilisation, but it can cause prejudice and discrimination. Someone else is given a job rather than that person, just because the person giving the job is prejudiced because they've read these facts that came from psychology research. And the last one, costs and benefits, are hard to predict. So that's strengths and limitations. If you are carrying out socially sensitive research, you need to consider in the first place many things. Who is funding it? So if there's a particular institution funding it, they may have an ulterior motive. How are they likely to use the results? Are the results likely to be used for political ends? Is it being funded by a political based organisation? All of those questions are important to ask. How is the research question framed? So consider things like if you were researching homosexual relationships, is it framed in a way to compare them with heterosexual relationships as the norm, or is it framed with a more open mind? Is it asking something like, is this racial group less intelligent than this? Or even if you just ask the question, is intelligence racially based, and conduct research on it, whatever the finding, it can give people the idea that it is scientifically okay that these things might have a basis in fact. Methodology. Before you conduct socially sensitive research, you must consider really important ethical issues, confidentiality and anonymity. So if you've conducted something to do with social classes, you must avoid identifying any schools or institutions because people may be identified. Equally, there can be really bad implications for the schools or the institutions involved when the research is published, so that's really important. Cultural bias in your methodology. How are you measuring intelligence? We saw in culture that an example of a test that was very culturally based.